Beautiful. We thank you for these gifts and all the gifts that you share.
One of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century is J.R.R. Tolkien, and his most renowned work of fiction is Lord of the Rings, from which our next two readings come. In the first, the character, an extremely old hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, recites his poem to his nephew and heir, Frodo Baggins. Readers know that when Bilbo was much younger, he experienced a dazzling variety of unexpected adventures, dangerous and deadly, transformative and enlightening, meeting creatures from legend and acting in events that will change the course of history and the life of Frodo. Bilbo's days of journeying to unknown lands are done. Maybe. The second reading is also from Lord of the Rings, wherein Frodo, some months later, is deep in the midst of enemy territory on a doomed mission with his sole companion from home, his gardener, Samwise Gamgee. They rest for a moment amidst danger, with treachery lurking nearby. And now, David Dreyer reading Bilbo Baggins' poem written by J.R.R. Tolkien.
I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, of meadow flowers and butterflies in summers that have been, of yellow leaves and gossamer and autumns that there were, with morning mist and silver sun and wind upon my hair. I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, of people who will see a world that I shall never know. But all the while I sit and think of times there were before, I listen for returning feet and voices at the door.
I don't like anything here at all. Step or stone, breath or bone. Air, earth, and water all seem accursed, but our path is laid.
Yes, that's so. And we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was kind of dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them. Usually, their paths are laid that way, as you put it, but I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back. Only they didn't. And if they had, we wouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on. And not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what the folk inside a story and not outside would call a good end, mind you. You know, coming home. Finding things all right, though not the same. Like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of tale we've landed in.
I wonder, but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. Take anyone that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to.
I wonder if we'll ever be put into tales or songs. We're in one, of course, but I mean, put into words, told by the fireside, from a big book with black and red lettering. And people will say, let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. And they'll say, yes, that's one of my favorite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad? Yes, my boy. He was one of the most famousest hobbits there ever was. And that's saying a lot.
It's saying a lot too much. Sam, to hear you somehow make me as merry as if the story was already written. But you've left out one of the chief characters, Samwise the Stoutheart. I want to hear more about Sam, Dad. Frodo wouldn't have made it far without Sam.
Now, Mr. Frodo, you shouldn't make fun. I was serious.
So was I, Sam. So was I.
My grandfather, Walter Shear, 1893 to 1982. He was a fisherman, a rum runner, woodworker, beekeeper, backwoods guide, hunter, veteran, and an awful storyteller. It's not that he had poor material to work with. That list of things, he really did all of those things. I love the rum runner stories, of which there were very few. But he couldn't stay on topic. He failed to give his narrative any structure, any plot. Sometimes, minute into any of his stories, you realized where it was going. Nowhere. You know the type of story I mean. Let me give you an example. I'm making this up. But let me give you an example of one of Pop Shear's, my grandfather, Walter Pop Shear, one of his stories. It might have a promising start. Me and Harry was driving his 12-cylinder Packard really fast. It was just after the Great War when one of the pistons blew and we swerved on that curve on Chestnut Road where the old mill used to stand, near where Stan Kowalski keeps his farm equipment, because his wife Ethel, she worked in a diner in town, and they made pretty good pancakes, but the syrup wasn't from local trees, and Esther, his sister-in-law, drew the picture on the diner's placemat, because she went to that girls' school, and even though she married Billy Bombarney, his mother Agnes was from Colden. Her maiden name was, you get the idea. What about the car? I don't remember any of the content from any of his stories, just that they rambled on, famously rambled on. And these ramblings could go on for a long time. Walter was famous for his ramblings, but not for his storytelling skills. A good storyteller with a good story is a marvelous experience. We've heard them here. The Soul Matters theme for this month is Living Love Through the Practice of Story, a fun and interesting spiritual exercise that many of you have already discussed in your chalice groups. The theme of story was featured in last week's sermon, and it is upon the subject of stories that I'd like to make a few comments this morning. The category of story is not one thing. Every myth is a story, but not all stories are myths. Myth is a story, but it's not the same thing as a legend or a fairy tale. A theatrical play tells a story, but it's not the same as a religious ceremony that reenacts a story. History can be turned into a story, and fictional stories themselves have a history. Events in our lives can be told as a story, and storytellers have been held in high esteem all throughout human history. In pre-literate societies, they were honored elders, male and female. They were what we might call today historians, judges, mythographers, ritualists, even physicians, where the healer recites the myth of creation to restore a person to balance and harmony with the cosmos. Humans are social animals, and our talking with others about our life experience is natural, evolutionary. Consciousness gives us these internal, silent conversations. Storytelling to ourselves, the silent internal narration of experience, is how modern humans process sensation and perception. Stories are the contents of our consciousness. We put experience in a narrative that follows our experience in the world of sequential time. One scene follows another. The internal storytelling that ignores sequence and logic we call dreams or myth. When we imagine our life as a story, we mostly weave together a series of short scenes. This translating of our life's experience into a story is to be shared, has its benefits. Self-storytelling, telling to another, is an essential feature of Western civilization. One need only to imagine the cathartic experience that we really think of sometimes with the Roman Catholic confessional, where the life story is told in hope of a reassurance of forgiveness and the acceptance of the assignment of penance. Sigmund Freud took the idea of self-storytelling of confession and transformed it into the centerpiece of his procedure of talking psychoanalysis. Right? You've seen the images, you lay on the couch, Sigmund is on the other side, and you talk. Whatever comes to your mind, let it flow. We understand the therapeutic benefit of talking it out, turning our experience into a story for a therapist or a friend, counselor, chaplain, any number of people. And because it is a story, then it is subject to interpretation, which then helps us better understand ourselves. When I was in private practice as a psychotherapist, I would ask my clients to tell me their stories. Research shows that changing the way a story is told can change the brain's neural pathways. In therapy, I would ask them to imagine how another character might experience the event that they wanted to talk about. Or I'd suggest inviting a helper, some imaginary friend of their choosing, and this new character would then experience the event, and we talk about what they experienced. Let them tell the story of the situation. I would ask, what kind of helper would you have liked to have had in that situation? Because it is a story, it can be edited and reinterpreted. The story can change, so the established neural pathways can be changed. Triggers then go nowhere. What?
Story?
Story? All right, story. When I was a kid, When I was a kid. All right. All right. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell the stories, and we knew, of course, now that you know, they went on. And so, in the kitchen or someplace at our farmhouse in western New York, south of Buffalo, I'm fourth generation. My grandfather, second generation, would be telling stories. My mom would be there, and she would be sitting across from him, and we'd walk into the kitchen, and Mom would give me the eye. I need to be relieved. I need to cook dinner. I need to go to the bathroom. I need to go outside and smoke a Territon, you know? And whoa, behold, boy, if we did not respond to her look of, I'm ready to be spelled, we would get into serious trouble afterwards. So, Mom, Pop, sitting there, and and then I would stand next to Mom, and Pop would be telling his story, and then Mom would stand up, and Pop would still be telling his story, and I'd move over, and Mom and I would change places, and Pop would still be telling his story, and then I'd sit down, and his eyes would move to me, and he'd be telling his story, and then Mom would kind of fade away. The story is not the experience, though in the retelling of the storyteller and the listener might experience similar feelings. There are indeed psychological and spiritual benefits to thinking about and narrating aloud our lived experiences, as if they were a story. Turn it into a good story. Many of you have heard my stories, and I've heard yours, and it's a marvelous experience. Tell me a story of your life. Someone might say that life is like a story. When we experience a major change in our circumstances, someone might say that we are starting another chapter. Only life doesn't have chapters, because we apply this literary form to help us understand change. We kind of think about it as a before and after, turning the page, new chapter, different way of thinking about things, because now, because of the event, we have changed. It's a helpful way to cope with change, because it's just that. It's a way to cope with change. We invent a way of thinking about it, and so it helps us. In the Iliad, Homer says, God sends disasters to mortals to give us something to talk about. And in such stories, the disaster, in the retelling of it, the disaster takes on a little bit of distance. It's a story now. It's out there a little bit. You're objective to it. And so you can tell the story. And it's this psychic distance is what I'd like to talk about next. There was a time in my life when I was an amateur photographer. I had equipment. I had cameras. I even had a darkroom. I would blithely observe the world, always listening to the voice of the photographic critic and editor in my head, while he narrated what or would not make a good photograph. The aesthetics of photography are undeniable. There is beauty in shadow and light, in color and composition. There's often a story in the picture itself. Photojournalism, successful photographs are the ones that, when you look at the photograph, it's live with action. It tells you a story. One day I became aware of my internal photographer, filtering everything I saw and turning it into a subject of a photograph. I realized that everything I observed was being judged to be photogenic, or not. Reality was appraised by the photographer narrator in my head as to what could be a good photograph. The world wasn't the world. It had become merely an object for me to take a picture of, to capture in my lens. My perspective of the world had become something separate from me. There was, in between, there was a camera, there was the critic, there was the aesthetic and technical considerations. There were questions of who would enjoy it and become a subject of a photograph. Being in the world with a camera in hand or hanging around my neck had come between me and reality. Alan, the photographer, took over all perception. There was always a photographer's voiceover narration talking to Alan all the time about what would make a good photograph. And I noticed that there was that voice telling me this would make a good photograph and this wasn't. And that was a change for me, is that I was aware of the person that was in my head that was telling me about what would make a good photograph. So I started leaving my camera behind. And slowly the photographer's voice was silenced because I couldn't take a picture. And eventually all of that faded. The separation of the subject, me, the photographer, the objective nature, they all faded, and what showed up next was just reality. No observer, no photographer, no filter, no inner voice, just reality. Eventually, there wasn't any longer any storyteller. He had shut up. Eventually, there wasn't any longer an observer and the observed.
The story.
Walter Shear was my grandmother's third husband. We never heard a story about the first husband, Janos, who was twice her age. When my grandmother died, I was 20 and a sophomore in college. I took the all-night bus to Buffalo, New York from Cincinnati. The funeral was properly Presbyterian, but the immigrant Hungarian wake was a drunken, boisterous, smoky, hilarious celebration, packed in our farmhouse kitchen on a cold February afternoon. When it finally ended, hours later, my mom and aunt were heading upstairs, and I was sitting talking to or listening to Walter, and he was going on with his awful storytelling. And as I started to get up, when my mom and aunt walked by, I said, perfect opportunity for me to get out of here and not listen to Pop anymore. And my mom, she put just a hand, and she gave me a look, and I knew I was in it for the duration. So I sat back down. A moment later, a glass and a bottle of brandy showed up, and a bag of Doritos. I was a college sophomore, right? So I had my basic things. And I sat there and listened attentively, just he and I, no tag team, no relief, way into the early hours of the morning, for hours and hours. Finally, he got tired, went to bed, I went to bed. And when I woke up the next morning, I stumbled downstairs to a hero's welcome. Pop had said, oh yeah, Alan and I sat up to the wee hours, and I told them all sorts, anyway, so. But they couldn't say anything to Walter about it. You can't say, oh gosh, did you ramble on till the wee hours with Alan? So when I came down, they were all congratulating me. I had a hero's breakfast. Blueberry pancakes, all my favorites. Everyone is gone. And actually, that event became a line in other stories. People would say, remember the time at Grandma's funeral where Pop and Alan talked into the wee hours of the morning? It became a family story. Author Margaret Atwood said that in the end, we all become stories. This is the only accurate because we can tell a story about Walter Shear, who is long dead, but a memory now because the story revives his life. Even so, the story is not the experience, just a description of the experience. The photograph is not the event or the experience. The menu is not the meal. The map is not the landscape. The story is not the life. My therapeutic question to myself and others would be, who are the various silent narrators in our mind? Even if it is true that our lives are not actually a story, we cannot easily get away from the idea that because life's experience can be so easily storified, we think in stories. The application of a storyline to our lives can be helpful in therapy, relieving ourselves of a burden in conversation with a friend. We talk about it, we get it off our chest like it's a weight that hurts our breathing, and we talk it out. There is a time that it's helpful for us then to analyze, edit, revise, replace, or silence all the storytellers in our head. I'm not to say ever that don't tell stories. My point is to be aware of the storyteller in your head who is narrating what's happening in reality. This takes an honest introspection to identify each distinct inner voice. We might discover that there are storylines that we have inherited, and they're not really us. Characteristics, right, of a character that have been imposed on us by other people's stories. We've become a part of the someone else's story, and we've incorporated it into our own. And it becomes real because it gets retold and retold. And sometimes it's just us that are retelling it to ourselves. As a schoolboy, I had an idea that I wasn't stupid, but that impression was contradicted every time I got an assignment back with a low grade. There can be a downside to all internal stories. But silencing the voices is one of the goals of mindfulness, quieting the narrator of the what-if scenarios, disregarding imagined alternative plots, ignoring the fantasy of, I should have said this. Just being aware that one is telling oneself a story is liberating. Mindfulness then is getting rid of the middleman, the narrator, the storyteller in our head, and then just experiencing reality. To silence the voice of the incessant inner critic, to get out of the rut of ruminating again and again about some scene, I offer some now scientifically tested suggestions. First, one of the most effective things you can do when your storyteller is going on and on is to distract yourself. We know this, right? How about this? Look at this, right? Distract yourself in some way from the story. You realize you're telling the story, distract yourself in somehow. One of the suggestions that the scientists, psychologists make is for you to think about what is happening around you immediately. What's physically happening around you? So you can move from inside your head to just saying, oh, I'm sitting in this chair, I'm looking at this, I feel that, I smell that. There's all of these things. And this distraction breaks this repetitive storytelling in your head that you don't want to hear anymore. What are my senses experiencing? And then you can immerse yourself in them. No voices, just you feeling. Second, if your inner story about the world is a mystery, a problem, an issue to be solved, write yourself out of the scene. We don't have to be always Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes. Tell yourself the story where, in this scene, you exit. There's the problem, there's you thinking about the solution, and you exit. And you say to yourself, I don't have to resolve that issue, and that's okay. Give the storyteller permission to immerse in the sensations of exercise 1. I'm not going to find a solution. Let me think about what's going on around me. Third, some people, though, do need to find a solution, right? Sometimes we've got a problem. We've got to work it out. We go over different scenarios in our head. We go, what about this? What about this? What about this? And we might ruminate. It might not be something that we can solve. And so what you try to do in that case is you can give yourself permission to think about it. Set a timer. Not more than 30 minutes. And you devote yourself to it. You could do journaling, problem solving, deductive reasoning, compassion. You can employ all of these for 30 minutes to try to solve the problem, address the issue, whatever. Science suggests that giving yourself permission to accept that the problem remains unsolved, unresolved, is not your failure. The last story, once upon a time, There was a person who was taken to a place where a large vessel with wonderful smelling stew was simmering on coals. And each person was given a long-handled spoon. A long-handled spoon. And there was the big pot of food, and they could reach up with their spoon and get some food, and then it wouldn't fit. They were spilling food all over themselves. They were hungry, they were frustrated. Some people even were using their spoons as a club. Next, the person was taken to a similar place. And there again was a large field with countless people and an enormous pot filled with great smelling stew. But all the people were sitting on the grass around it. Some people were just talking, laughing. Some people were having a discussion. And the person who was there looking at us said, why is this place different? The vessel is the same. The spoon is the same. What's the difference between the first scene of hunger and anger and this scene? And the person who had taken them there to see all these says, well, here, the people have learned to feed one another.